for she was taken out of man. And we think that all of a sudden is Spock from Star Trek. And he's doing an anatomy observation. And he's saying, species match detected. And that's not what's going on in the Hebrew. What he's saying is he was longing and there was something in his heart. And now he's saying, God, you have created something that I need and it's here. And I'm looking at her with wonder and adoration. And I don't know what you did, but it's awesome. And then he's like, come here. And look at the verses that come after. It says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. And so we need to understand this isn't just sexually, but it's relationally. She fulfills something in him, and he needs her near him. Okay? And this is how God intended it. And I want us to understand what is going on here. And so if you look at the Genesis 2 heart, there's mutuality. There's vulnerability. There's understanding. There's innocence. There's a non-competitive, generous spirit. And their worth came from their image bearing. It came from who they were because God made them. They're not thinking about the other person in comparison. And now we look at what happens in Genesis 3. And you know the story with the snake. But I want to read verse 16 and some of the stuff I've shared before. But I want us to really hone in on how our spirits changed after the fall. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. And that's a different sermon for a different time, but scholars think that that's not just talking about labor. It's talking about a childhood urging and an internal clock and this desire for a woman, the connection a woman has with her children because they were inside of her, and it's a connection husbands or dads don't have with their kids. There's more there, but anyways, what we want to focus on is your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And we've talked about this before. In the Hebrew, that word, your desire will be for your husband. That phrase, if you flip your page over to Genesis 4, verse 7, we've talked about this, but it's worth repeating. Cain's about to kill his brother Abel, and God knows that. And so he says, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. Think about that. There's this tiger outside your door, and when you walk out and you grab that club, there's this tiger and he wants to consume you, but you must master it. And so what the author is saying, he's not saying your desire will be for your husband, that you will cuddle him and you'll watch romantic comedies, but he doesn't like that. And he wants to push you down. He wants to stay away from you. It's your desire will be that you will dominate and control him. You will claw your way to the top, but he will push you back down. And so after Genesis 3, we see a desire to dominate and control. And it comes out of fear. It's fear of the other. It's distrust, misunderstanding, shame. There's a scarcity spirit, not a generous spirit. There's not enough power to go around. And our worth comes from our comparison to others. And when we look at roles and we look at powers, we justify who we are in a sense of value by looking at somebody else and making sure I can get higher than them. This is the Genesis 3 spirit. All of us have it by default. Unless God breaks a human being and puts them into Genesis 2, you will not have this by default. And every human being is in Genesis 3. So when we get into Ephesians 5, I need us to understand that right off the bat, Paul is saying something important. And so the first verse that he shares, it's a bridge verse. It belongs to the last section, but it also belongs to this section. I want to read it. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And right off the bat, we need to know that verse 21 is the verse that helps us understand this section between wives and husbands, but it's also the section between children and their parents, and it's also the section between slaves and masters. As human beings, we do not have any desire to submit to one another. And Paul was saying earlier, if you are someone who has the Spirit of God, you will be someone who submits to others. You will not always defend yourself. You will not always have to be first. You will not always get offended by people. You will not always push your way to the top. You'll be somebody who can take correction. If you can't do those things, you are not filled with the Spirit of God. That's paramount. And Paul's saying that. So what I want to do is I want to look at these two sections, and I want to admit right off the bat that these verses 22 to 24 are hard verses to look at. There's two phrases specifically our culture can't handle, and there's been a lot of pain and oppression in these verses. Verse 22 says, submit yourselves to your own husbands. And the other one is the husband is the head of the wife. And so some people see these, and there's a huge red flag when we look at this passage. And I want to share with you that I personally have grief over a misunderstanding of this section. There's two family members I have, and both of them, the husbands, used these verses to destroy their wives. And they're very close to my heart, and they're family members. And so this is hard. And maybe you have come from a family where these verses were taken out of context, and they were meant to say something that they're not. So I want to look at these verses, I want to explain what it's saying, but I want us to also know that just because a passage of Scripture has been used to harm people doesn't mean it should be avoided. And in fact, there should be courage and honesty to seek out the truth even deeper and to get into the healing, not to avoid this passage. So the essential principles that we're going to need to do this passage well is that we need to submit to one another, because when we're submitting to one another, ultimately it's submitting to Jesus Christ. It's not for our mate's sake or our soul's mate's sake or whatever. It's for Jesus that these things are here. And that changes it big time. And the second thing is we need to understand that men and women actually are distinct. Adam needed someone distinct from him to provide what he lacked. He didn't need another man. And so what I want to explain here as we're looking at it is Paul is saying, wives, submit to your husbands, and it looks like this. Husbands, you will submit to your wife, and it'll look like this. And maybe you haven't seen that before. We're going to look at this passage. All I want to do is I want to unpack what he's really saying, and then we're going to talk about this as a church. Okay? So what I'm going to do is let's just go through these first verses that Paul is saying, and I want to kind of maybe help you understand what Paul is saying and what he's not saying. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Okay, so that word submit, it's used in verse 21. 22 borrows it. It's not actually in verse 22, but he's saying wives in the same way that 21 was, so you must too. And then he uses it a couple more times. And I just want to just quickly look at what this word means. And so this is from it's called Bible Hub. It's a website. Anybody can go on there and you just type in a word and it shows you what it is in the Greek. And so this is a military term, and this word means to arrange under. This comes from two words. Hupo means under, and arrange is tasso. It means to willingly come underneath and arrange yourself underneath someone else, underneath their leadership. And so there's a couple versions, this verse is used, or this word is used, subjecting ourselves to, willingly submitting ourselves to authorities. God put all things under Jesus' feet. God placed all things under Jesus' feet in Ephesians, and Jesus subjected himself to Joseph and Mary. Even though I think Jesus didn't probably have to. But he was a good son, and he just said, I want to do this for you. Okay. I want to look at this here for a little bit. I think when we think about this, when we think about headship and we think about what somebody is to be a head, I think we think of a CEO. Do you guys think about that? That word head? You think of the head of a corporation. You think of somebody like Tesla, right? The guy who owns Tesla. Who's that guy? Elon Musk. And so I think when we think about what it means to be a leader of an organization or a leader of something, I think we think a CEO, they have big Christmas bonuses, and they're the face of the company, and all the recognition goes to them, and they have a corner office, and the rules don't apply to them, and they get to go to the ribbon-cutting ceremonies of children's hospitals. And it's kind of like, I put in my hard time, and so leadership is a reward for the hard work that I put in. And that's what our world teaches, right? If I serve and if I do the hard things, then eventually I get to be this guy. This is what Jesus thinks of leadership. This is what Jesus thinks about him being the head. So in Matthew 20, verse 26, you guys remember this? This is Jesus directly confronting the Genesis 3 spirit in his disciples. And he's saying, this is what leadership looks like. Because they say, can we be number one and number two? You can be the CEO, but we want to be the COO, and we want to be the CFO. And Jesus is like, why? What's in that heart of yours? And so in Matthew 20, verse 26, 25 and 26, he called them together and he says, you know the rulers and the Gentiles lord it over them. And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so I think what Paul is saying here, when we go back and we look at these verses, is that the husband, he's saying, this is a picture. This is a symbolic picture of Christ and the church. And he's saying that in the very, very top purpose of why you are married, why marriage exists on earth, is that Jesus would be able to show his love for the redeemed, for this world. That's why the husband is called the head. Do you see what it's saying? It's not saying the husband is the head because he is capable. He's not a better leader. He's not more qualified. There's nothing about him that's superior in any way. And in that culture, people believed that the man should be the head of the house because women weren't as smart as men. And this isn't what Paul's saying. Paul's saying this has nothing to do with any of this. This is a big picture of the church and Christ. And all of the book of Ephesians is about, I'm saving the world. I'm redeeming the world. I'm making it a different place. And so he's saying that, man, you are visibly with your wife showing the world what it could look like, what this could look like in your world, big picture. And so a wife, we're going to look at this more later as we get into this passage. What does it mean to submit to her husband? It doesn't mean necessarily to obey. That's a different word that's going to be used with children and their parents and slaves and masters. It's not the same word that's used here. And so maybe you guys are thinking about this and you're thinking, what does it mean to submit to my spouse? It means to respect him and to give him the ability to lead, even though you're probably maybe even a better leader than him. We're going to look at more about how this stuff works, but Paul's saying all of this exists ultimately to show the world Jesus. Okay, now, we get probably more stuff we can talk about this, but I want to get to the guys section because the guys section, actually there's a lot more to what the guys have to do than women. And we're going to look at culturally how this all works at the end of this. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. How does a husband submit to his wife out of reverence for Christ? How does he do that? Through his love. And what kind of love is that? Is that buying chocolates and getting flowers? Is it watching? It's not Sleepless in Seattle? Or it's a sacrificial love. It's dying to himself. Okay, this word gave himself up. Let's just check this word out. This word is used to hand over, to delay, to deliver, to betray. It's to commit myself. And so this word was used about Judas. When Judas betrayed Jesus, he handed Jesus over to the chief priests. This is crazy. Rox, you're totally right. The husband is made and meant, the way that he submits to his wife is to lay down his life, to give up. To give up. And so, men, we need to hand over and desire, we need to hand over to Christ for our spouse's sake, our desire to funnel all of our ambitions and energies and dreams into our own sense of self-achievement. It's about channeling all my ambitions into what? Making my spouse holy. Think about this. Jesus allowed himself to be killed for our sake as a church because he wanted to rescue us and make us pure. He wanted to make us holy. He wanted to present us to himself beautiful and perfect, and so he let them slaughter him. So this is I listened to another pastor speak on this, and he's like, this is the gulp. When the guys read this passage, this should be a big gulp. Paul says, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his wife loves himself. And after all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. And if you look at this word, holy and blameless, the beginning of Ephesians, this is what it started off with, didn't it? This is God's desire. This is why the whole book of Ephesians is written. All of us here in ABC, God's desire is to make you, to transform you into something you've never been, to make you perfect and beautiful and spotless. And so this passage here, where we look at husbands and wives, is a little picture here on earth of God's big picture for our world. Imagine if you viewed your marriage not as something that you can give and take, but ultimately that you are like these actors who are acting out this divine, beautiful love story for the whole world to see. And the world sees this and they think there's something going on. There's this chemistry that goes beyond some honeymooner stage. There's something intense that's been developing between you two, and there's something there that I have never seen before. Where is it coming from? And so Paul says that if we love our wives, husbands, if you love yourself, you will not despise her. You will give up everything for her. And you will care and you will feed for her. And just look, let's get nerdy here again just a couple more times. This word's atrekpho or something like that, I don't know. It's to bring to maturity, to nourish. This is all about a husband giving his life up to equipping his wife to come underneath. Jesus is saying true leadership in our world is to come underneath someone and to submit to them by equipping them and making them more than they were before. It's using all of your resources and your energy on the other person, not yourself. This is the first word, to feed. And the second word is to care. This word's thalpo. And this is to cherish or nourish or foster or to comfort. It's this sense where I love you and you belong to me and I am in awe of you and I care for you and I adore you. And what is it going to take to make the world know that I'm obsessed with you, that I love you, that you take my breath away? Paul's saying that this honeymoon stage that couples go through in the beginning is just infatuation, but when you get serious about your marriage, it can do something completely different. Okay, verse 31, Paul says, for this reason. What reason? When New Testament authors say things, are they just pulling stuff out of their butt, or are they trying to quote it in context? For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife. What reason? Have you guys thought about this before? Go back to Genesis 2. It's a fulfillment of God's design. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. Remember what came right before that? It's totally about the design. You're right, Gord. The husband looks at his wife and he has breathless, absolute adoration for when he sees Eve. He sees her and he says, you're not a chimpanzee, you're not a zebra, you're not a giraffe, you're not all these other things. You are the one that was made for me and I was made for you and we are connected and this is what I was made for. And Paul knows this, and Jesus has quoted this for this very reason. And they all are understanding what is going on here. Behind the scenes, can you see what is going on? And then Paul says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. Verse 31, he's not talking about Adam and Eve. He's talking about God. Jesus Christ comes to earth, and he is just like so intense. He's so after us. He loves you so unbelievably. And Paul's saying, husbands, wives, do you look like this? Does your marriage actually look like this? Like you are just enthralled with the other person? And Paul's saying that if you choose to submit to one another in your different ways, and if you lower yourself and you don't worry about if the other person's doing this or that, or if it's a contract, it's going to transform everything. So I just want to quickly just share an illustration. I was supposed to do it earlier in this sermon, but I'm feeling a little nervous here. But a long time ago, I was an electrician. Well, not that long ago. And my buddies, some of them had joined the union. And I was like really against the union. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be one of those kind of guys. But they're like, no, just join it. It's like really good. There's really good benefits. You work hard. It's like it's a good setup. And eventually they said, okay. And I finally went over to the union. And I remember my first day, we were on this big site at this winery, and I was going through an orientation. And there was this young kid there. And he was like a real weaselly kind of guy. I met him at one of union hall meetings, and but anyways, I'm talking with this guy, and he says, why haven't you joined the union earlier? And I was like, well, I heard the rumor that if I joined the union, there wouldn't be enough work, and we'd work for 3 months, and then we'd be off for 6 and 3, and I got a wife, and I got some kids on the way, and like, I can't do that. Like, this is like a serious thing. And he's like, oh. And he's like, well, it's actually true. You are only going to be working a couple months of the year. And I thought, oh, what have I done? What have I done? And so I started to work with this kid, but then I just started to see something about him. You see, when you get this big union, there's this huge union, and there's these major electrical corporations at the top, and they do what's called a CBA. Like, you know, if you like hockey or whatever, a CBA is a collective bargaining agreement, right? And you you come to the table, and you're like, this is what the rest of the workers want. And then the table on the other side, these big corporations come back and say, well, this is what we want to do. And they go back and forth until they can agree on something. It doesn't go into arbitration, hopefully. And then that's your contract. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And this kid was all about take. You owe me this, and I'm only going to give you this. And for him, it was us and them. That was his attitude. It was us and them. The company is the enemy. And so he would get these, they're called 2-week call-outs, and people would say, we needed somebody from the hall. So they would get him there, and he would steal from the company. He would cheat on his timesheets. He would do all this stuff, and it would always be 2 weeks, and you're back on the hall. And so that's why he was like, it's true, you're going to be unemployed most of the time. And I wasn't ever unemployed because I just cared that I had a really awesome job, and I was thankful to be there. Can you see the difference? A Genesis 2 spirit versus a Genesis 3 spirit. Okay. I want to just share something here. A pastor I really like, I know, and I'm getting to know, he said to me something that pierced my heart. And he said that you will be made weak, and your wife will be made strong, so that you will know that you need her. And he said to me, there will be times in your ministry as a pastor where God will not tell you things, and she will tell your wife things, so that you will become weak and she will become strong. And there will be times when she will need things from you that she can't get from herself, and she can't take from you, and only you can give them to her, because God is trying to make you interdependent with her. God wants to break you so that you will know that you need her, and you can't do this on your own. Have you ever thought about that? Have you had enough spiritual discernment to know that sometimes God speaks through your spouse because he wants you to submit to them, and he wants you to be broken, and he wants you to know that this person is valuable? Do we value our spouses this way? This is what God wants for us, that we would look at this other person the way Adam did, and he's like, come here. I need you. God wants to do this in our hearts so that nothing can break us and our marriages. God purposely does this. And so I want to share something here. God's purpose for marriage ultimately is it's not about you. It's not even about your spouse. Ultimately, the reason you're married, and maybe you don't know this and we're just looking at this now, the reason you're married is because it's a visible declaration, it's a symbol to the world that Jesus loves this world and he loves his church. It's not about you. It's not about you and your arbitration process and making sure it's 50-50 and keeping it down the middle. It's about him. And the second thing, the purpose for marriage, the reason God allowed you to get married is because it's a means of sanctification. God is going to use your spouse to break you. He's going to use your spouse to encourage you. And he's going to use your spouse to build you up in the faith. This is why you're married. Sometimes we look at our spouses and we're angry with what they say to us, and sometimes we don't actually understand it's the voice of God, and it's his grace to us. And the last thing is that we can fulfill something in our spouse's needs. Adam was alone, and God said it's not good for him to be alone. And I want to share something here. It's stereotypical. It's a little bit stereotypical, and it doesn't always work out every single time, but I want you to think about this as an example sometimes. Maybe, depending on your family of origin and the different things you've been through in your life, maybe it doesn't always apply, but I want us to maybe think about this. And Kelsey said, this isn't a catch-all, and I said, yeah, you're right, it's not a net. This isn't happening all the time, but this is real sometimes. Men sometimes have a sense of selfish accomplishment and security through the things that they achieve. Okay, maybe that's an over-stereotypical thing, but I know a lot of guys who find their sense of identity in what they can accomplish on earth. And they push and they push and they push, and they put their families on the back burner because they need something inside of them that says, I need to show that I'm worth it, that I'm valuable. And so a Genesis 3 heart takes control of his spouse in every relationship for the sake of ambition and significance because he needs to show the world he's worth it. And the Genesis 2 heart submits to his wife because she gives him that reverential respect. She gives him that sense of, I love you and I look up to you in a certain sense. And I mean, there's more to this but I'm just giving one example. I've seen this before. Women sometimes have a sense of self-accomplishment and security through relationships. Women, you're better at relationships than guys. Is that a no-brainer? So us guys, when we get together, we kind of fake relationship. Girls can get together and they can have like real good, honest, vulnerable relationships. Guys get together and we got to put the hockey game on. And then we can vicariously conquer through our team. And we're like, we're doing great. It's like, you're not on the team. You're just a guy watching the team. But guys feel connected to each other, and guys connect through relationship, through achievement. And so we need help with this. But I think sometimes women, they take control in relationships because of belonging and the desire to be secure. And sometimes it's for a sense of significance as well. But I want us to understand that sometimes God purposely has these deficiencies in our life, these things that we need, and he knows that our spouse can provide it for us. Genesis 2, woman's heart, she submits to her husband because he gives her something she can't take from him. This is a painting of Jesus and his bride. Someday we will all be made perfect and we will be with him, and we will see things the way that they are supposed to be, the way that they've always been meant to be. And here on our earth, we have the chance to do this by the power of the Spirit, to submit to one another and paint this little picture every day for the world to see. And so I got a couple questions. I want to just end with N.T. Wright's, maybe you watched this video. This is a quote from him, and he says, if Paul's words seem outrageous in today's culture, we should ask ourselves, do our modern societies in which marriage is often a tragedy or a joke really offer a better model on how to do it? Our world's stuck in Genesis 3, and we get some models and some different things to figure it out. Is it really working that well in our world? Or do we have to give Paul another look here? And so there's more here. I wanted to start talking about this cultural things going on in the text too that we haven't talked about. I just wanted to unpack the passage. But I want to first start with this question here. I want you to think with me, what is going on? Is this passage countercultural? What do you think about this question? Let's talk about this. What Canadian cultural values stand in the way of fulfilling Ephesians 5? And what's in stake when we follow our world? How about me? You do you? Yeah.
We're also an individualistic culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a situation where what can I get out of it, not what I have, what can I give into it?
Yeah. You guys have said some good stuff. There's a couple things I've thought about. Submission to others is wrong. A husband to his wife and a wife to her husband, this is wrong. Our world doesn't say this isn't true because we have self-autonomy. People are whole by themselves. They don't need anybody else. I'm a whole unit. If I admit that I have a failure, then it's going to lead me to depression or something. So I'm perfect. I don't need you. What about this one? No distinctions in gender. That men and women aren't actually any different. Their desires, their sense of self-awareness, their sense of self-understanding, their sense of self-worth. We don't want to stereotype all how men and women work, but would it be okay if we thought about the Bible the way the Bible talks about men and women were created in the image of God, male and female, He created them? Do we want to admit that, or do we think that men and women are actually the exact same? And that my bros can give me something that my wife can't, or your girlfriends can give you something that your husband can't? Do we really believe that? What do you guys think?
I'll step on a limb and
Yeah.
say, I think there are some things that women relationships can give as opposed to
Yeah.
a husband-wife relationship.
Yeah. So, So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying, are there different things that your spouse can give you that your friends can't? Because you're right. I think that there is general fellowship with people, but is there something that a spouse can give that a friend can't or not? Yeah? Is there anything else?
Well, we are giving our marriage would be an illustration to the world of what Christ's love for the church is. So you don't have that with friendships.
Mm-hmm. What about where God seriously throws us in the furnace of refinement with our spouse? Where God uses our spouse who knows us better than any person because we live with them every day to show us and to mold us and to shape us and to change us and sometimes even to break us.
That's not a very popular idea because it doesn't work. I'm out of here.
It's the fulfillment of God's purpose that we can't do it on our own. We
Mhm.
need the completion of the other.
Yeah.
But we always want to do it on our own, and that's where the conflict comes, I think.
Yeah.
But if we look back, like you say, to Genesis, that's God's intention of wholeness and completion. That a man or a woman can't do it on their own.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in our culture today, we tend towards, guys, hanging out with guys or needing that to an extent where it's just going to build me up. I need a guy to kind of have somebody, reassure me, like, yeah, I can do this.
Yeah.
Rather than going to your spouse or whatever to say, no, I need you to accomplish this as God's purpose.
I think so.
So how does this work then for single people? Is that imply that single people aren't whole because they don't have someone? Because Paul wasn't married.
Yeah. So, I wish we had time. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and Jesus even talks about this too. He's saying, if you can accept this, that some people were made eunuchs, some people choose to be eunuchs, and I forget what the third option is. He's saying, if you can accept this and live for my kingdom, unrestrained, and you don't need the connection, and you can do it for God's sake, God will give you the strength. And so Paul says that God will provide the grace. That's why it's a spiritual gift. There's some people who have the gift of celibacy, and God has specifically called them, because Paul says, if you get married, you're going to have to love your spouse and give up for your spouse a lot of your time. But he's saying God gives the grace to certain people, and he fills them so that they can be used of his kingdom. So like John Stott, amazing man of God, did so much for God's kingdom. He was celibate his whole life, and God gave him the grace in this relational area. And so, I mean, what you're talking about too, about can our friends give us this? Yeah, there is a certain sense where that's happening too. In the book that we were talking about, Rich Valadas, he talks about this. So there's more to the story. But I just want to ham it in here right now about Ephesians. I think you're right, but I wanted to share one last thing. We haven't talked about the cultural because I didn't want to use this as a chance for us to delete or white out our whole Bible in Ephesians 5. Some people will just say this is cultural, so verse 21 applies, and the rest is kind of talking about something a long time ago. I do want to mention, though, culturally, in that time, men were probably sometimes 30 and their wives were 16, 17. And they weren't also educated. And they didn't have rights. He had rights of property. She didn't have rights. And so there's more going on in the text here. And I want us to understand that when we look at husbands and wives and how this is going to actually pan itself out, we need to be honest with ourselves and we need to be realistic. And we also need to have grace on the other person. And so Paul isn't saying, husbands, be your wife's boss, because she's not capable. That's not what he's talking about. And so when we talk about how this actually pans out, here's one last question, and we're going to do communion. What's a practical way that a wife would submit to her husband? What's a practical way that a husband would submit to his wife, based on what you've seen? How could you take this into your life? And Paul's really clear. It's not the husband's job to enforce verses 22 to 24, and it's not the wife's job to tell her husband, you need to do this for me. It's our job to submit to Jesus Christ through our spouse, regardless. What are some practical ways? How could this look in our society now?
I say, what can I give into the relationship? What can I pour into the relationship? Rather than what is the relationship going to do? What can I get out of it? I mean, that's the skewed idea we have about love, is I love something because of what it does for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I love an ice cream cone, or I love my car, or whatever. And God set the standard for love, in that he said, God gave, so loved us that he gave.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take that to heart, and what we can pour into the relationship, and the fullness of that is the benefit, that it comes back to you in a loving relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think that anything that's an other-centered, self-sacrificing love kind of covers both of those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is there a way, like, should we just take verses 22 to 33, and instead of the woman doing 2 things and the guy doing 4, all of us just do 6? Or is there a certain sense where it's saying, women, pray over that, fast over that, think about what you can do for Jesus' sake, and between you and the Lord, figure these verses out, and men, these are what God's calling you to do. Pray, fast, think about this with him, and do that. Or is this just saying all these verses actually apply to all of us? That's something I just want to challenge us with to think about. And I'm not going to answer that for you. Just pray about that. And Jesus wants us to be people that after 5, 10, 15, 30 years of marriage, you sometimes see these people, and they're a husband and wife, and they are just in awe of the other person. And somebody else tries to get in the way, and they're just like, no, you're not. This person's the most important person in my life. And I've found a diamond in the rough, and I am just clinging to this person because I've never met someone like this. And I've met people like this. They've been married 50 years, and you're obsessed with her. What happened there? It's way more. It's this deep, intense loyalty. It's not like some infatuation, like some honeymoon thing. It's you obviously see something in the other person that I don't see because you are connected to them in this way. Okay. I want to lead this into communion. Jesus in Mark chapter 10, we've read the Matthew version. I want to read the Mark version. The brothers come and they say to Jesus, "We want you to do whatever we ask for you." And Jesus is like, "Okay, what do you want me to do for you?" And they say, "We want to be your right and left hand guys." And Jesus is like, "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I can be baptized with? Are you willing to die the way I am going to die for everyone?" He said, "We can." And Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not for me to grant. These places have been granted by my Father, or prepared these places belong to those whom they have been prepared." And when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. And Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers and Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And Jesus, when he was with the disciples, it says, knowing that he was going to return to the Father, Jesus knew who he was. This wasn't a self-awareness thing, and he wasn't thinking, "Oh, am I good enough, or what are people going to think?" Jesus, knowing that he was going to return to the Father, he took off his outer garment, and he wrapped it around his waist, and he washed their feet. And so I want to invite Gord up. Gord's going to help me serve communion today.